poem written by Armenian poetess Zabel Si Boyajian. And she really aroused great interest for my own research. And all I can say is that today I will be talking about Lazar Kostic and his poem from 1864. At the end, I will make a parallel with the poem written in 1916 by Armenian poetess. And I also see at this end, my beginning, as I would say, I see the possibility of new research, and I would like to make a comparative paper on these two poets. It is actually about transcultural appropriations of Shakespeare in Central Europe. So, as you know, Central Europe in the late 19th century can be seen as a transcultural contact zone for various cultures. The German influence was dominant throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire, populated by diverse cultural entities expressing themselves in German, Hungarian, and a whole series of Slavic languages. In the Slavic areas, educated people would, along with their mother tongue, speak, read, and write in German and Hungarian and in Latin. Along with a heightened awareness of the national traditions, European Romanticism aroused the cosmopolitan eagerness to know and appropriate the legacy of foreign traditions, attitude which was best expressed by Goethe and his term Weltliteratur, or world literature. As the focal point of literary enthusiasm expressed by the German Romantic poets and philosophers, Shakespeare reached Slavic readers via German translations and theatre productions. As regards Shakespeare in Serbia in the 19th century, two phases of reception can be discerned. Until 1859, Shakespeare was read in German, not in English and not in Serbian translations. The challenge of translation was there, and Lazar Kostic, poet and playwright, a most original linguistic innovator in Serbian language, translated Capulet's Orchard Scene and published it in 1859. On the tercentenary of Shakespeare's birth, in 1864, Kostic wrote a 138 lines long narrative poem which served as an epilogue to the celebration held at the National Theatre of Novi Sad. When published, the poem was given a simple title, On Shakespeare's Tercentenary. Its meaning and its form, nevertheless, are far from simple. The poem begins with an intertextual play based on the most famous text of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Book of Genesis. In the first 11 lines, Lazar Kostic gives his own poetical wording to the well-known subject matter: the division of light and darkness, earth and water, the creation of plants and animals, and finally the creation of man after God's own likeness. The poetic voice is expected to continue with God's repose on the seventh day after the creation of man, but there Kostic adds his own hypertextual layer to the biblical hypertext by introducing a vivid alteration. He poses a rhetorical question. Was man so admirable a creation? Was he such a hard and demanding work to do? Oh no, says Kostic, don't you believe that? God, in Kostic's interpretation, was not content, because only the outer likeness of man was worthy of the Creator, and all the rest was merely weakness and misery. Oh no, continues the poet, God was not in for a rest, but for more work to do, in one being, in one life. He was about to unite all the beauty of all beings, to melt darkness and light, night and day, angelic bliss and the fire of hell, unfathomable, pearl-like lakes and vertiginously elevated pinnacles. Nightingale's song and serpent's furious hiss, ghastly chill in the midst of summer's heat, rose's scent and poisonous smell, and all that tumultuous, awesome commotion, he would fit into one person, in one mind, and did it God, created Shakespeare's mind.
Wow.
It is well known that the German Romantics symbolically equated Shakespeare's creation with God's, just as David Garrick in his Jubilee Ode in 1769 called him the god of our idolatry. The quasi-deification of Shakespeare, as Jonathan Bate has shown in The Genius of Shakespeare, has its roots in the 18th century England. Shakespeare was identified as an original genius, as you know, by Addison, who counted him among the greatest poets of all times, Homer, Pindar, and the Old Testament prophets, in the Spectator articles, as well as by a number of other English authors throughout the 18th century. Voltaire commented wryly that in England at that time, Shakespeare was rarely called anything but divine. In opposition to the influential Shakespeare was rarely to the influential French, now classical poetics of drama, the Romantics throughout Europe, including France with Victor Hugo, began to praise Shakespeare's imagination, genius, and originality. With Romanticism, says Bate, poetry was elevated into secular scripture, Shakespeare into God. In Kostic's poem, as we have seen, Shakespeare is not God, but the masterpiece of God's craft, God's human continuation. Someone with whom God is willing to share the pride in creation. Furthermore, Shakespeare is a grateful and generous son of his heavenly Father, for he shares what has been given to him. Let's paraphrase Kostic's argument. He couldn't let the received interiory wither within him, but he had to engender a new world and to amplify the world known to the humans by doubling it up. Both in England and in Germany, the elevation of Shakespeare to the status of original creative genius, and therefore comparable metaphorically to God the Creator, coincided with the adoration of Shakespeare as national poet. In England, according to Jonathan Bate, it was in relation to the emergent nationalism, popular Francophobia, and aristocratic Francophilia. Developing his argument from Isaiah Berlin's analysis of nationalism as, quote, response to patronizing and disparaging attitude towards the traditional values of a society, a result of wounded pride and a sense of humiliation in its most socially conscious members, which in due course produce anger and self-assertion, end of quote from Isaiah Berlin. Bate concludes that the veneration of Shakespeare as English national poet was in first place a response to a patronizing and disparaging attitude towards his works on the part of French critics and a Francophile court taste. Curiously enough, Shakespeare's genius seemed to have served the same purpose to the Germans as well, and in relation to the same French culture, in many ways regarded as superior in sophistication. Appropriated by the Germans, Shakespeare was consequently reappropriated by other cultures, Slavic in particular. Kostic read the commentaries on Shakespeare by Gervinus and Delius, editor of Shakespeare's works in German and co-founder of Shakespeare's German Society. Nevertheless, the form he employs to revere Shakespeare is entirely his own experiment in Serbian language. The dominantly trochaic rhythmical phrase of the Serbian language is substituted by the iambic rhythm. Serbian language has very few monosyllabic words, just as Armenian, as we heard yesterday, a multitude of polysyllabic ones, which inevitably inquires longer meter, and hardly any words with a stress at the last syllable. In this particular poem, Kostic manages to keep the iambic rhythm. Also, he manages to create alliterations, which are not frequent poetic device in Serbian prosody. After the quasi-biblical extra-diegetic third-person narrative, the poem turns into a dramatic oration addressed to the English bard. The Serbian poet identifies the bard as elevated spirit, and his own self as a representative of a young nation. In the mid-19th century, German intellectuals were aware of the newness of their culture and struggled to overcome the French cultural superiority by finding support in Shakespeare's original genius. In the second half of the 19th century, a representative of the nation which was in the process of liberation of the centuries-long Turkish colonization, and part of it under the domination of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, speaks on behalf of one of the newly born in the process of birth or yet unborn nations. The research into Kostic's reading and commentaries shows no references to Julius Caesar, nor to the famous line uttered by Cassius, about the states unborn and accents yet unknown, which would be the best explanation of his position in relation to Shakespeare. he invokes Shakespeare with his own and his people's situation in mind. The need of recognition and self-recognition, understanding and self-understanding, the need to reconcile the controversial inner tendencies. He asks Shakespeare to help them by the power of his art to reduce the base habits, to weaken arrogant and haughty scoundrels' cries, to dilute the shameful glories and glorious shames. All that should lead to painful and palliative self-interrogation. On the other hand, he asked for just recognition as well, and expects Shakespeare not to demean what is entirely glorious in his people's achievements. Having uttered the worshipful appeal, poetic voice wonders where the reverent demand will reach Shakespeare. The bard succeeded so many times to elevate us, the humble recipients of his words, to the heights of heaven. So one should expect an inconceivably higher otherworldly abode for Shakespeare himself. Costi's superlatives, as you see, are overabundant. Even if Shakespeare is to be found in the deepest pit of hell, punished because he dared do the heavenly work, that is not credible either. He who could fashion the fervour found in his plays would manage to pacify the infernal blaze. So, a more intense place has to be found for Shakespeare, and Costi sees it in the unique realm of Bard's works. In that kingdom, Shakespeare, king-like and godlike, rules himself, surrounded by his heroes. The way to mediate the hopeful demand is to bequeath it to Shakespeare's characters and expect them to pass it on to the bard, king, god. By bestowing his plea to Hamlet, Juliet, and Richard Gloucester, Costi actually gives micro-interpretations of the two plays he had by that time tried his hand on in translations, Romeo and Juliet and Richard III, and of Hamlet, which he obviously knew intimately and would translate it 2 decades later. Hamlet is first seen as a martyr, and only afterwards as a skeptic. Juliet is also a martyr, a saint, and a faithful lover whose very breath Costi imagines as a medium by which his words would be communicated to the bard. The third one to speak to the bard is Richard Gloucester, icy hedgehog, whom Costi asks to bend his knee in Shakespeare's presence when passing on the Serbia poet's epistle. Serbian 19th century Shakespeareans is that of troublesome self-recognition. Costi fears that the king of poets might not be sufficiently honoured by an insignificant offering. Why would the British bard, asks he, protected by a mighty halberd, care for one or another obscure tribe? According to Costi, the entire West envies Britain and Shakespeare. Costi further on affirms the Serbian people's fate, which is surprised only by their stubbornness, their pride, and finally the sharp wit of his people, which Shakespeare might find congenial and worthy of respect. All the rest is lowly and poor, determined by down-to-earth toil, lack of advancement towards heavenly treasures. Costi begs Shakespeare to teach his people to elevate their eyes, mind, and spirit. At the end of the poem, Costi voices the frustration of a minority culture in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He admits that the German-speaking people knew better how to pay tribute to Shakespeare. The bard might be more pleased by their creative offerings, but Costi doesn't see his people as willingly being integrated and blended into a dominating culture. They want to stay what they are. If by any chance the English bard doesn't believe him, Costi invites him to become one of the Serbs. We are presented here with the poetic encounter of center and periphery. The poet who lived and wrote at the very margins of the 19th century Europe was well aware of the respective significance of the English, German, and Serbian cultures, forming a symbolic triangle in this poem. Shakespeare marks the angle of originating English culture. The German culture is seen as mediator and the Serbian as recipient. Political and economic power relations influence the status of literary works, but there is also another moment which should be taken into account, the moment of aesthetic communication and aesthetic education as understood by Goethe, Schiller, Kant, and Hegel, and which, surprisingly, Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak, in her 2013 book, An Aesthetic Education in the era of globalization revives as old, revisited, live kernel of comparative studies of literature and cultures. Young Serbian poet admits that from the perspective of the 19th century European centers of culture, Serbian cultural position can be viewed as subaltern. We are so poor, we after treasures reach, but digging into earthly deepness still, we have not yet the sky graving skill. We now beseech, oh teach us that, oh teach. He is also aware of the colonial hybridization attained in the encounter of German and Serbian cultures. For another Shakespeare tercentenary, celebrated in London in 1916, the Armenian poetess Zabelsi Boyajian wrote a poem in 4 quatrains entitled Shakespeare. Shakespeare's ontological position is similar to the one Kostic assumes. The poet is great, eternally living spirit. The first line goes, great unknown spirit living with us still. He is omnipresent. The third line is there a land thy presence doth not fill? And he is universally communicative. According to this poem, Shakespeare seems to be at home in Armenia, and his sweet music converses with the poetess's heart, just as Lazar Kostic sees him as someone to whom 19th century Serbs are eager to listen. The intercultural moment is there also, in a similar sense, in both poems. Zabel Boyajian acknowledges the tribute that other nations bring to Shakespeare to honor him, just as Lazar Kostic admits that the German-speaking people knew better how to pay tribute to Shakespeare. Political and economic relations are also implied. Zabel Boyajian writes, to honor thee, thy country's foes combine. However, the final similarity is most striking. The suffering moment of an aggrieved, wounded, and humiliated community and its humanity, unable to come onto the scene of an encounter with a first world culture, is expressed in the image of the crown of thorns which Armenia can lay upon Shakespeare's shrine, just as Lazar Kostic depicted the subaltern, twice colonial position, Austrian and Ottoman, from which he and his compatriots still want to speak to Shakespeare, honoring him with their difficult and troublesome experience of the world and being in the world. The conclusion one can draw is the same. The freedom to carry out a vivid dialogue with Shakespeare originates from aesthetic education, that is, from the achieved capability to perceive foreign literature in the sphere of aesthetic experience, and therefore in the sphere of a specific supranational freedom beyond cultural hegemony. Thus, Kostic and Boyajian both choose Shakespeare as collocutor with whom they can face a series of ontological and political questions they regard as urgent. As collocutors with minor reputation in the context of world literature, they both express desire for free poetic exchange with omniscient comprehension and benevolent attention, open as wide as Shakespeare's mind.